Well, hi, everyone. My name's Amy, and I'm the museum coordinator at the North Lanark Regional Museum. And thank you all for joining us this evening for our digital speaker series. This event has no ticket cost, but we do encourage you to make a donation to the North Lanark Historical Society. We are a not-for-profit organization that is dedicated to the collection, preservation, and presentation of local history, and your donations help to ensure that we can continue to offer these fantastic events. The link to our donation page will be put into the chat box of this meeting. We do ask that you mute your microphones to limit any background noise, but you're welcome to leave your cameras on if you would like. This presentation will be recorded and the video will be used for promotional and educational purposes by the Historical Society and will be posted on our public YouTube page. We are also going to be attempting to use the live transcription feature on Zoom this evening. So if you're experiencing any issues related to this, please let me know in the chat box. I'm very happy to now welcome our speaker for this evening, Robert Gardiner. Robert is a local amateur historian and author of a new book on the history of Pakenham to be released in early 2023. Please join me in welcoming Robert for his presentation on the Battle of Pakenham.
Thank you, Amy. I'm Robert, and today I'm here to talk about the Battle of Pakenham, which took place on a cold November afternoon, not much unlike this afternoon in 1838. All right, so the Battle of Pakenham, as I mentioned, took place 184 years ago this month. But it's really less a story about a battle and more a story about a man versus the world, a man who turned neighbors against neighbors and instigated decades of personal conflict. This man was Archibald MacNab, better known as the 13th chief or laird of the MacNab clan, which was a traditional Scottish Highland tribe. MacNab was born into a broken home in 1781, but even more broken was the MacNab clan itself, whose chieftain, Francis MacNab, Archibald's uncle, was said to be a drunkard, braggart, and whoremaster who quite literally drank and gambled the family fortune away. Francis had no rightful heir, and so Archibald MacNab inherited the family's estates upon the death of his uncle in 1816. But it was no gift. The lands he received were heavily mortgaged, such that the new laird owned £35,000 in outstanding debts on properties that generated only a mere £1,000 in annual income. MacNab was unable to come up with the money, and his creditors constantly harassed him for the money he owed. It got to the point where debtor's prison was likely to become MacNab's destination. He needed a way out of Scotland and fast. So in the early 1820s, MacNab traveled to Upper Canada and convinced colonial authorities to let him bring his tenants from Scotland over to Canada and settle them in a township under his name, in a township that he had control over. This township was to be called MacNab Township, which at the time was a mostly unsettled region located within Carleton County. Renfrew County didn't quite exist yet. It was bordered by Pakenham Township to the south, which was also barely settled at the time. And so beginning in 1824 and 1825, MacNab transported several dozen families from his estate in Scotland to the new township and established his headquarters at what is now Arnprior. And so here you have a historic map of MacNab Township. Most of these places didn't actually exist in 1838, but you can see it basically extended from Arnprior in the east to Burnstown in the west and down to White Lake in the south, which is cut off a little bit, and up to Sandpoint and Braeside in the north. Now, settlement schemes such as MacNab's were relatively common throughout Upper Canada at this time. Other notable examples in Lanark County being the Lanark Society settlers, which settled in the Lanark area, and the Peter Robinson settlers, which settled near Pakenham and Almont. Often these schemes involved one person bringing over a big group of people, usually poorer people, and settling them in an unsettled wilderness. But MacNab's scheme was a little different. His plan was to own the land his tenants worked on and lived on in trust, and his tenants would pay him quit rents to reimburse McNabb for the expenses he incurred by shipping the settlers across the ocean. Quit rents, of course, being like payments or property taxes or rent towards a feudal landlord. Once the debt was paid, the land would be theirs. He was also granted 5,000 acres of land and sole superintendency over the township. In effect, McNabb was basically creating his own little kingdom. Now, from the very beginning, government officials suspected that McNabb had ulterior motives, especially being keeping his tenants perpetually in debt so that he would not have to forfeit any land. This is a tactic that feudal landlords have used the world over. Essentially, if you keep your tenants always in debt, they're always in your control. And they predicted that that was what was going to happen in McNabb Township, but they were eager to have McNabb Township settled. And McNabb was quite, I guess you could say, cunning, and he won over the hearts and the minds of the colonial government at the time. Now, of course, the government's suspicions turned out to be true. As the tenants were brought into the woods and they had to clear their own farm, many of them found it difficult. Many tenants found that they could not pay the quit rents McNabb demanded from them. They struggled with clearing trees on their lots to build farms. And of course, if you can't build farms, you can't generate income. And if you can't generate income, you can't pay back McNabb. And many had been settled on unsuitable farmland, of course. And when they couldn't pay, McNabb would take them to court and sue them. And since many of the settlers were poor and illiterate, McNabb would always win. It seemed like no matter what the settlers tried to do, the house would always win. And of course, McNabb had many political, I guess you could say, political friends within the justice system and within the government. He had a lot of influence there. And so whenever he went to court, it was sort of a foregone conclusion what the result was going to be. And as this went on, the settlers became increasingly agitated by McNabb, and McNabb became increasingly hostile towards his settlers. And so tensions began to rise throughout the 1820s and the 1830s in McNabb Township. And here you see some of the things said about McNabb during this period. His attitude towards his own settlers were apathetic at best, and he gained a reputation for cruelty. And he also gained a reputation for being a poor businessman. He was often sued by local merchants for failure to pay for goods. This includes Robert Harvey and John Powell, who were the first settlers at what is now Pakenham Village. And another thing he did was he claimed that he owned all the timber rates in McNabb Township, which he didn't, of course. But nobody could really prove him wrong. Anytime he was taken to court for cutting logs or cutting timber on property he didn't own, he'd always win somehow. And he was always able to lobby politicians to vouch for him in the legislature. And so he basically did whatever he wanted in McNabb Township because he knew nobody could stand up against him. And it was at this point where the government and the people of McNabb realized their worst fears had come true. McNabb was attempting to introduce the European feudal system to Upper Canada. Sensing that public opinion had turned hostile toward him and fearing for his safety, McNabb grew increasingly paranoid. He abandoned Arnprior and moved to the shores of White Lake, where he constructed a stone house, which is still standing. It's now a museum in White Lake. Arnprior turned into sort of a ghost town as a result, and it would actually be smaller than many other nearby towns in the area, including Pakenham, up until the 1860s. And this is because everybody who was loyal to McNabb, and he did have a few loyalists, and everybody who worked for him, which was a lot of people, they all had to follow him to White Lake. So he basically created his own little village where everybody was friendly to him, and he left all the Arnprior people to themselves. Now, this brings us to the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. They were actually two separate rebellions, one in Lower Canada and one in Upper Canada, but the two rebellions shared common themes relating to political reform, responsible government, and greater political freedoms. In Upper Canada, the rebellion particularly targeted the Family Compact, which was a network of wealthy families and individuals who held almost all political power within the colony. In Upper Canada at this time, there was a lower house and an upper house within the legislature. The lower house was elected, the upper house was appointed by the lieutenant governor, and the upper house had most of the authority. And so, of course, the lieutenant governor just appointed all of his friends. And so if you could lobby the lieutenant governor, and if you could become friends with the upper house, you basically had the entire government backing you. And so this is sort of what the basis of the rebellions was about, trying to get more elected representation in the legislature. And although McNabb was not a member of the Family Compact, of course, being the upper house of the legislature, the appointed people, he was certainly friends with many influential members in the government, and many members who, again, I'll add, constantly vouched for him in the courts and the legislature. And so, of course, McNabb had a vested interest in putting down the rebellion as quickly as possible. Now, shortly before the rebellion broke out, the 2nd Carleton Light Infantry Regiment was formed. It was a militia unit composed of men from McNabb, Pakenham, and Fitzroy townships, all of which were a part of Carleton County at the time. And here we have a map of Pakenham Township from about the 1870s, so many decades later, but of course still relevant nonetheless. And of course, here we also have Fitzroy Township, which was Pakenham's neighbor. And so being in the militia at this time was a mandatory civic duty. All able-bodied adult men had to serve. They were poorly trained and poorly equipped. They weren't given uniforms or rifles or any of the sort. They had to bring their own weapons if they had any. And if they didn't have any, then they marched with sticks and clubs meant to mimic marching with a rifle. And usually the militia would muster a couple times a year, and it would be a big deal. The men would all turn out because they had to. Most of them would get drunk. And of course, the children and the women would come and watch, and it would be a big community event, usually with a lot of alcohol involved, and as we'll see, often with a lot of fighting going on as well. So at the regiment's head was McNabb himself, and here you see a much older picture of him. Second in command was Andrew Dixon, who owned the mills in Pakenham. Being an officer in the militia at this time was a big social status. It had nothing to do with military experience, because very few people had military experience. It was mostly based on status within the community, because in theory, people would be willing to follow community leaders in the battle. So McNabb, of course, being the most prominent person in McNabb, Pakenham, and Fitzroy, was the leader. Andrew Dixon was second in command, and there were many other officers from the area as well. The size of the regiment varied, but it typically ranged between 300 and 450, depending on how many turned out. But it was not a happy regiment, and it was all McNabb's fault. On Christmas Day, 1837, he mustered the militia in Pakenham village, and it was a depressing sight. McNabb made a long patriotic speech while the men stood in the snow and froze. And so after hours and hours of McNabb going on and the men just sitting around doing nothing, they became angry with them and they demanded to go home. McNabb was not happy about this sign of insubordination, but he agreed to dismiss them because it was Christmas Day after all, but the anger toward McNabb still lingered. A few weeks later, McNabb mustered the McNabb Militia Company, so just the part of the militia from McNabb. He mustered them at Sand Point. And it was here that McNabb proclaimed to his settlers that they were being placed under martial law. He told them that he would be taking them to Toronto, where the rebellion had broken out, and he threatened to whip anyone who would not follow him. But the McNab men weren't buying it. They stood firm, they stood their ground, and when McNab asked for volunteers, only 2 men stepped forward. And of course, they were both employees of McNab, so go figure. McNab threw into a rage and dismissed the regiment and walked away very angry. And a week later, the men reconvened again, but this time in secret. They were doubtful that McNab had the authority to declare martial law, and so they wrote a petition to the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, claiming that they were, and I quote, willing to serve Her Majesty in any part of British North America, where Your Excellency may think proper to call us under any other commander than McNab. A number of us have suffered severely from McNab through the course of the civil law and are afraid, therefore, to come under him in the martial law, being harsh in his disposition and also inexperienced. We hope it may please Your Excellency to look into our circumstances as people misled by McNab. When McNab learned of the petition, he considered it to be mutiny. And after all, it kind of was. Common soldiers don't get to choose their commanding officer. It's not that democratic. But obviously, the settlers of McNab Township had their own idea. And the settlers of Pakenham and Fitzroy also considered this to be mutiny. The majority of them were Irish Protestants, also known as Orangemen. They were pretty much all Anglican, and they were fiercely conservative and very loyal to the crown. Thus, the 2nd Carleton Regiment became divided: Scottish versus Irish, Anglican versus Presbyterian, conservative versus progressive, and most importantly, loyal versus disloyal. The stage for the Battle of Pakenham was set.
Giving me computer audio.
And that's when fate intervened. In November of 1838, a group called the Hunters Lodge launched an invasion into Canada from across the St. Lawrence. They didn't get far. All they did was fortify a windmill along the riverbank, as you see here. But this threat to Canadian sovereignty set off a massive military response across Upper Canada. All militia regiments were ordered to assemble at once. And of course, McNab ordered his regiment to assemble in Pakenham. So what was Pakenham like in 1838? Obviously, there are no pictures from that era, but this is probably the closest thing we have. This is the earliest known photograph of Pakenham village, and it was likely taken in the 1850s or early 1860s, so about 20 years or so after the battle. Here you see the bridge on the right, which was really just a crude wooden thing. And on the left, you can see the falls, which are kind of blurry. And the far left, you can see some horse stables, and you can even see part of a mill there sticking out by the falls. And now the big stone building with the 3 windows that you see and the 2 chimneys, that was the focal point of town. That was Andrew Dixon's office and store, and he also used it as a house for a while. It's still standing today. I'm sure most Pakenham residents are familiar with it. Every time you drive across the bridge, you see it. And the smaller building that you see just beside that was the post office at the time. Now, Pakenham was only a shell of its current self then, and so probably the only buildings that you see in this photo that were around in 1838 were the mills on the left and possibly the stone house at the end of the bridge. It was built by Andrew Dixon around 1838 or 39, so it may or may not have been there at the time of the battle. If it was there, it would have been brand new. And here's my poor excuse of a hand-drawn map. Certainly no artist. Pakenham Village was really just a small cluster of buildings at the time, centered around the falls. The current town site was not surveyed until 1840, when Andrew Dixon laid out the streets himself. The population of Pakenham Township at this time was likely somewhere between 600 to 800, 600 to 900. In 1842, it was 1,100, and in 1832, it was about 300. So probably somewhere in between there. I think 800 or 700 is a good estimate. And the village population was likely around 100 people or less, really just a few households, Andrew Dixon, his family, and anyone who worked for him. So in number 1 on this map, we have the village schoolhouse, which wasn't actually built until about 1838 or 39. So again, it might not have actually been there at the time of the battle. At number 2, we have McFarland's Inn, which stood around where the feed and seed is today, by that corner there before you turn onto the bridge. Isabella McFarland was a recently widowed woman in her 30s at this time, and she was left to raise her children all by herself. And since she couldn't work and since she had no income, she rented out beds in her house to overnight travelers and fed them meals, and she made a pretty good living doing it. Later, she would build a much bigger hotel and make much more money from it. But at this time, her house was probably nothing more than a shanty or a log cabin, which was typical of most buildings in the Ottawa Valley at this time. But little did she know that her house was about to become the scene of the Battle of Pakenham. And Isabella was actually Andrew Dixon's sister. So that just goes to reiterate the fact that Pakenham Village was really just a Dixon family affair at the time. And on the east side of the river was Andrew Dixon's house. Number 5, the post office. Number 4 and 5 as well as the mills. And so this is how Pakenham Village really would have appeared in 1838. And so to recap, McNabb had ordered the regiment to assemble in Pakenham in mid to late November of 1838. And one witness recalled that day, he said, they assembled at Pakenham 900 strong from McNabb, Pakenham, and Fitzroy townships. It must have been a sight to see those 900 men standing around the village in groups, waiting for orders. The men from Fitzroy and Pakenham were eager to fight the rebels, and when McNabb asked for volunteers, the response was almost unanimous. But McNabb's own clansmen, the Highlanders from McNabb Township, refused to volunteer under their chief. Not only did they despise him as their feudal lord, who had cheated and tricked them for years, they also remembered an occasion in Scotland when their volunteer services were abused under McNabb's uncle. The Highlanders regarded themselves as loyal British subjects, but they would not fight under a McNabb. And so fair enough, but the men from Pakenham and Fitzroy didn't see it this way. Primarily made up of Irish Protestants, the Pakenham and Fitzroy settlers were ardent loyalists to the crown and were clearly resentful of this mutinous display. They began to hurl insults at the McNabb settlers, and as one source claims, to punish the McNabb settlers was now the object of the Irishmen from Pakenham and Fitzroy. The day wore on and tensions rose. At some point in the afternoon, a fight broke out between Pakenham residents and McNabb militiamen. And after the fact, it was rumored that McNabb had deliberately set one group of men against each other to teach his rebellious clansmen a lesson. And some lesson it was. After an initial fight in the streets in which they were badly outnumbered and badly beaten, the McNabb men regrouped at McFarland's Inn and raided the small shanty for weaponry. They distributed frying pans, kettles, pokers, tongs, brooms, and every article of solidity against their own and prepared for a fight. In short order, the quiet inn by the falls was transformed into something resembling the Alamo, as the McNabb men faced repeated assaults by the Irish from Pakenham and Fitzroy. The fighting was pretty much all hand-to-hand. There would have been a lot of fists being thrown, a lot of people being hit by sticks. Firearms were fairly rare at the time, and even if you did have one, there really wasn't much ammunition or powder to go around. And again, they were muskets, so they were not really the most practical weapons. And so the fighting dragged on until sunset. A late autumn snowfall began, and with the temperature dropping and nightfall nearly upon them, both sides gradually lost the will to fight. Then a messenger suddenly arrived with a notice claiming that the American rebels had been defeated by the British during the Battle of the Windmill, and thus the 2nd Carleton Light Infantry Regiment would no longer be required at the front. With that, tempers ebbed, and both sides began to head for home. The MacNab men never again took up arms against enemies of the crown or their chief. And so ended the Battle of Pakenham, which has gone down in history as being the only engagement in Canadian and maybe even British military history that was fought entirely between soldiers of the same regiment. So certainly quite the distinction. The number of casualties is unknown, but it has been remarked that, and I quote, "many heads were cracked and many ugly wounds received." And the battle's only fatality appears to have been a man known only as Porter, who died of his wounds 10 days after the engagement. So it all makes for a compelling story, if you choose to believe it. In 1989, Peter Hessel, a local historian of MacNab Township, published an article in the Armprior Chronicle Guide newspaper about the battle. Hugh Halliday, who at the time was the curator of the Canadian War Museum, happened to read the article and did some investigating of his own. Despite the fact that he specialized in early Canadian militia history, he had never heard about the Battle of Pakenham. His research concluded that there was only one account, only one primary source which details the battle, and it was certainly problematic given that it was written 30 years after the fact, and other than that, there is very little evidence of it occurring. Now, Halliday and Hessel wrote letters back and forth, debating over the finer details of the battle. And while I was doing my own research about the battle, I found their letters tucked neatly away in the Armprior archives. So what follows is an explanation for some of Halliday's critiques about the battle, and a rebuttal from Hessel as well as myself to some of his arguments. Now, Halliday never said the battle was fiction, but he did put forth some questions that were left up in the air and that were unexplained by the one account that was written by it. So firstly, why did no one write about the battle? And why did it take 30 years, 3 decades, for the battle to surface? Who was Porter, the unfortunate man who died following the battle? Halliday noted that there's no record he ever existed. And lastly, is the evidence reliable? After all, 30 years is a long time. So the first thing that caught Halliday's attention is that why was there only one account of the battle? In fact, the only account was published by a man named Dugald MacNab in 1869, who we'll just call Dugald from now on, so we don't confuse him with the other MacNab. And it was published, again, over 30 years after the battle occurred. He had written a biography of MacNab in the Perth Courier, and within that biography, it mentioned the battle. No correspondence from MacNab, nor Andrew Dixon, who's pictured here, survive about the battle. And it appears that they didn't write about it to anybody. It wasn't even published in the Bathurst Courier, the predecessor of the Perth Courier, which at the time was Lanark County's only newspaper. And in fact, I'll get to that next. But well, there are several different explanations for all of this. The first is that MacNab and Dixon probably didn't write about the battle because they didn't want anybody to know about it. After all, both men had political aspirations. And so being the commander of the only regiment in Canadian history to fight itself does not look very good on a resume. And it certainly would have been very embarrassing for their leadership. A second possibility, of course, is that the correspondence simply disappeared over the years. I mean, it was 184 years ago, and I think that point basically just speaks for itself. A third reason is that most settlers were illiterate. This is especially true of Irish settlers, so they were unlikely to write about it themselves. And if you recall what I said about the schoolhouse in Pakenham, you'll know it may not have even been there in 1838. So there were very few educated people in the Pakenham area at this time. And of course, the Battle of the Windmill, which occurred at the same time on the same day, was a much bigger news story. And As I was saying, if you look up the copy of the Bathurst Courier for that week in 1838, the Perth Library has it online, the archives of the Perth Courier. The entire newspaper for that week and the weeks after, that's all about the Battle of the Windmill, which was a big event, right? It was essentially Americans trying to invade Canada. Meanwhile, Pakenham was just a backwater at this time. Nobody would have been interested in reading about it. It was not as big of a news story. Which brings me to my last point. Maybe nobody wrote about the battle because nobody cared. And after all, this is because the Irish were always fighting. There were the Ballygiblin riots of the 1820s, which involved Irish Catholics in Carleton Place and Almont. There were the Shiner Wars along the Ottawa River in the 1830s, which were basically roaming gangs of angry Irish loggers. And so the Battle of Pakenham really wouldn't have been that out of character for Irish settlers at the time. Drunken Irishmen fighting over religion or politics was really nothing out of the ordinary. And obviously today, something like this would be far more significant. So we'd be far more likely to write about it. But in the 1830s, a bunch of drunken Irishmen getting into a fight was really not that out of the ordinary. It's really just a part of daily life. And hell, I mean, even today in Pakenham, drunken Irishmen really aren't that hard to come by, let's face it. Halliday's second argument was that there was no evidence that Porter, the man who died, ever existed. And that's pretty easy to explain, as you can see here. At this time in history, your name would have only appeared in documents. That would have been a birth record, a marriage record, a death record, and a property record, like a deed or a grant. So if you weren't born in Upper Canada, if you weren't married in Upper Canada, and if you didn't own property in Upper Canada, it would have been very hard to trace you. It would have also been relatively easy to die anonymously, especially if you didn't have a family to record your death record. And many people didn't have families since they came to Upper Canada alone to work, to get money, to buy a farm, and then they sent for their family later. So it's very possible that whoever this Porter man was, he was a stranger. And then there's also the reality that he might not have been named Porter. Dugald may have just made up the name. After all, trying to remember the name of a stranger who died 30 years ago isn't easy. And so he may have just chosen a name that he thought was reasonably close. Porter may have also been the man's occupation rather than his name. Lastly, Halliday's third argument was that he was unsure if Dugald's account in the Perth Courier could be relied upon. After all, 30 years is a long time, and the fact that Dugald was actually 15 at the time of the battle means he couldn't really have participated in it. We also know that Dugald did exaggerate some of the facts. For example, he claimed that 900 people assembled in Pakenham on the day of the battle. This is despite the fact that there were only 450 people in the 2nd Carleton Light Infantry Regiment, and that was on paper. Usually only about 300 or so actually showed up. In fact, 900 is an absurd number because that would be a big crowd even in today's Pakenham, let alone in 1838 when the population of the entire township likely did not exceed 900 people. Essentially, he doubled the number of people that were there. That being said, while Dugald may have exaggerated things, probably to sell more copies of his biography, he certainly didn't make them up. He worked as McNab's secretary at the time of the battle, and was very well could have been in Pakenham on the day it occurred. Also, 30 years isn't long enough for something like this to fade from living memory. Obviously, details can fade, but not the event itself. Many people who witnessed or took part in the battle were still alive when Dugald wrote his account in 1869. Most of the important characters, such as Andrew Dixon and Isabella McFarlane, had only recently died, but their kids were still alive, and Andrew Dixon's wife was still alive. And Isabella McFarlane's son was actually a member of Parliament at the time. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that it would have been impossible to fabricate the story and not be called out as a liar. That would be like me writing a story today in the Millstone or the Almont Gazette about a fictional battle in Pakenham that took place 30 years ago, say in 1992. Pretty much anyone who lived in Pakenham in 1992 would know that I'm making it all up, and they could easily call me out on it. So why would I make it up? And the same applies in the 1860s with Dougal of McNab. He would have known that if he had made it up, people would have called him out on it. And the fact that Isabella Macfarlane's son, Robert Macfarlane, was a sitting member of Parliament at the time, he would have attracted a lot of unwanted attention if he had lied. And Dougal's biography of McNab is generally historically accurate, so there's no reason to doubt the accuracy of the battle as well. And we know the battle was plausible given the mutiny of the McNab settlers earlier in the year, and there's no reason to doubt that they try to mutiny again. So all the pieces were really in place. So what really happened at the Battle of Pakenham? Well, the battle was likely a drunken fistfight between two groups of men who were known to have hated each other. The story was probably exaggerated over the years by people telling and retelling the same story. And so after 30 years or so, it got blown up into a much bigger event than it probably was. Likely what happened is that the McNab men made it clear that they refused to fight, and some drunken Irishmen from Pakenham started a fight. And after a few hours of exchanging insults and punches, both sides probably began to sober up, get cold, and with nightfall descending upon them, they decided to go home. This is really what happened at the Battle of Pakenham. Probably the best comparison for the Battle of Pakenham would be the Ballygiblin riots in Carlton Place in Almont. They actually had a lot of parallels with each other. For example, both events occurred at a militia muster when the fight broke out. Both events were sparked by hatred of an ethnic group hatred by an ethnic group against a ruling citizen who had power over them. And both events involved Irish people. In the Ballygiblin riots, it was Irish Catholics rioting against a much more powerful British figure. In the Battle of Pakenham, it was Scottish people fighting against Irish Protestants, and as well as McNab, who had power over them. So there are many similarities between the two, and the Ballygiblin riots are probably the best comparison that I can think of for the Battle of Pakenham. It's basically the Battle of Pakenham was Pakenham's version of the Ballygiblin riots, in many ways more than one. And so as for the people involved in the battle, they all met many different ends. Worst of all was McNab, who lost political favor with the government following political reforms after the rebellion. Essentially what happened after the rebellion is the elected figures had much more power. The lieutenant governor and his friends were stripped of a lot of powers. So McNab had no more influential friends. This meant whenever he went to court, he often lost. He began to lose money, he began to lose face, he began to lose influence, and eventually he left. Isabella Macfarlane, whose shanty was rudely intruded upon and vandalized, built a much larger inn on the same site a few years later and ran it as a fancy hotel until her death. And of course, Andrew Dixon went on to build Pakenham as it is today. So that brings us to the end. But if you liked what I said, you can pre-order my upcoming book, which covers many interesting stories of Pakenham's long history, including things like the Big Fire of 1940, when a large segment of the town burned down, as well as a little-known secret of the Cold War, which went on in the Cedar Hill area. So the books are probably ready, are expected to be ready in February or March. So if anyone has any questions about either the battle or my book, feel free to ask. I'm all ears. And I can drop a link to the pre-order in the chat. But yes, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them.
Thank you so much, Robert. What a fascinating story, honestly. Yes, if anybody had any questions they'd like to ask, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and ask the questions or type them into the chat box where I can pass them forward. So feel free to do that now.
I heard about McNabb when I was teaching in Arnprior. And is it the same McNabb who came from a property that had standing stones in either Ireland or Scotland, or is it a different McNabb?
I think it would have been the same one. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it would have been the same one. The problem is there were a lot of McNabbs in McNabb Township because they were all part of the same tribe. And we encountered that here when I was talking about Dugald McNabb. So there were many different McNabbs, but yes, the McNabb was certainly the most influential and really the only one who had property in Scotland. So yes, that's most likely the one who you're referring to.
I'm looking up this is Fern here, and I'm looking up the play that I wrote about Pakenham, and for some reason I had 3 different groups, and I'm just looking at the script here to see who, I could be wrong. Catholic Dogans, the Orangemen, and the McNabbs. For some reason, I thought there were 3. Am I wrong, Robert?
There very well could have been 3. Dugald's
go.
account really only mentions the 2, the Orangemen and the Scottish.
Now, I don't know where I got my information. The Pakenham Fencibles were mostly Irish Roman Catholic. The Fitzroy Blazers were Anglican Orangemen, and the McNabbs from Renfrew, they were Presbyterian Scots. So it mentioned Fitzroy.
Yes, yeah. So Fitzroy was majority Protestant, and so was Pakenham at the time. There were a lot of Robinson settlers in Pakenham as well who were Catholic. So that may have been where that information comes from. But the majority of the fighting, according to Dugald's account, was between Protestants and the Scottish, Irish Protestants and the Scottish.
Yeah.
There would have been a lot of people on the sidelines. I think about Andrew Dixon. Andrew Dixon was Scottish himself, and he was very progressive at the time, very liberal. He would have questioned McNabb's authority. And so he likely would have sympathized with the McNabb settlers, but he was second in command of the Pakenham regiment, so he couldn't have joined in. And it would have been a personal affair for him as well, because his sister's house was caught up in it. So yeah, so there would have been a lot of people on the sidelines of the battle for sure.
So another question, you have done a tremendous amount of research. That must have been pretty difficult.
Yeah, a lot of time spent in the Arnprior archives looking for information, and elsewhere too, and in newspapers and everything. I really did try to find more sources other than Dugald's. But again, it seems like his source is the only one that existed. And Hugh Halliday, who wrote these letters, he noted, and I didn't include this in the talk, but he noted that there is a lot of correspondence from McNabb from this period, and a lot of it about the militia. And for some reason, there's nothing about the Battle of Pakenham in this correspondence, even though every other incident, every other militia muster is talked about a lot. The petition that the McNabb settlers wrote, that's very much spoken about. So it's just sort of missing information. Yes, Duncan, I think has a question.
Yeah, Kathy mentioned the Scots, and there's a lot of McNabbs. I was on a tour there. We went by where the last home was, or the last holdout for them was, and they said that the guy went to Canada and we don't know what happened to him. So I told them a little bit about his popularity in the Arnprior McNabb area, and said that he then moved on from there. And I had already gone to Panama, but I didn't know really where he'd gone. But that's you don't bother going to Scotland to look him up, because they don't seem to know over there.
Yeah, and I heard that when he came to Canada, he actually left his family in Scotland. So he wasn't only running away from money, from debt. He was running away from his family, and it seems like a lot of other people over there as well. He was a very complex character, a lot of different shady ulterior motives going on in the background. And nobody really, I guess it's really hard just to understand who he was as a person, not a very nice person, that's for sure, and his motives.
Yes,
Well-
Robert. Gord Donaldson here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Two things. Just wondering where the exact location of the Battle of Pakenham was, and if anyone has ever gone in with a metal detector to see if they can find any artifacts being metal. And number
Right.
two, in Werner Ross McGiffen's 2 volumes of the history of Pakenham, if there's any mention of the battle in that.
So I'll start with the second question. Yes, there is. It's in the first book, the green one, that covers 1823 to 1860. There's a brief chapter, like a sub-chapter about it. It includes Dugald's account, which I summarized here and quoted from here. But yes, it is in that book. And the first question about the location, we know McFarland's Inn was where the feed store in Pakenham is now, the Feed Seed. It would have been sort of at the corner, I guess Hudson's Corn, they sell corn there in the summer, so it
Yes.
would have been there. There's actually a map of Pakenham from the 1900s that shows the second edition of McFarland's Inn, the second one she built. And it was right along the street, basically right at that corner near where the corn stand is. So that's I guess the most approximate location where that park is today by the bridge.
So it was a central location, but unfortunately the soil has probably been disturbed over the last 100 years with the flour mill and
Yes.
the new flour mill and the Hudson corn, as you were saying. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
mostly.
Really enjoyed your presentation, Robert. That was well researched. Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert?
Yes.
Yes, very interesting presentation. I'm retired military. I really don't consider this to be a battle. Why, how long was it referred to? When was it referred to as a battle other than a drunken brawl?
I believe Dugald coined the term. And obviously, of course, it's
At the time, was it referred to as a battle, or how was it referred to in 1838?
well, we don't know what it was referred to in 1838 because, as I said, there's no documentation from 1838. The earliest mention is from 1869, in which case he does refer it to as the Battle of Pakenham. It's obviously an exaggeration. I guess the best way to coin it would be a brawl, a fist fight. All hell broke loose, basically. It certainly wasn't a battle from a military perspective, but of course it did have a military backdrop to it. And again, as I said in the presentation, it seems like every time someone talks about the battle, it gets more and more exaggerated. Hopefully I didn't exaggerate it again here. So that's probably how the term came to be. People just sort of made it seem like a bigger deal. Maybe they were trying to impress their grandkids or something with these tales. So yes, that's probably what it was.
Well, the merit aspect of it is the statement you made that it was the only regiment to fight within itself. I'm not sure that's 100% correct, but why would you, what would your support be for that statement?
That was in a letter from Hugh Halliday. He said it certainly would have been one of the only battles in Canadian history, or maybe even British history. I'm sure within British history it happened a lot more often. But within Canadian history, something like this would have been quite rare. And especially within the militia, people at the time, you really didn't have a choice. Like you had to be loyal, right? Or else you were labeled as a rebel, especially during this time. So to have a group of people stand up to an authority figure would have been quite a big deal at the time.
Great, thank you. Wonderful job.
Thank you. I guess Andrea has had her hand up now for a while. Andrea, do you have a question?
To Andrea, I'm afraid we're not able to hear your audio coming through. I don't know. You're not muted, so I'm not sure if it's speaker issue. Perhaps you can type your question into the chat and we can get it that way.
If anyone else has a question in the meantime, you can ask. You can go ahead.
Hi, it's Randy Larkin. I have my hand up, so is it okay if I just go ahead, Robert?
Yeah, go for it.
Robert, that was very interesting. So thank you for that and for your research. It was very, very interesting session that you provided. I guess as a fairly long time Pakenham resident, I've been here 25 years, which I'm probably still a newcomer by most people's standards. However, I have long-time ancestors from this area. So I do feel I have to stick up for the drunken Irishman references that you kept putting forward. I'm not sure all my ancestors would like to be referred to as drunken Irishmen, and that those battles were simply a result of a bunch of drunken Irishmen. Those drunken Irishmen probably had a cause or some kind of, they were disgruntled about something, whether they were Catholics or Protestants. But I'm sure if you look back in your literature, you'll find it was more than just being drunken Irishmen. As well, the reference to the drunken Irishman today, except with the exception of me being maybe the drunken Irishman, I'm not sure you're going to find that many as you referenced in our locale. What I wondered about was, you said the Protestants of Pakenham and Fitzroy were fighting against the mutinying McNab settlers. So were the mutiny, maybe I missed this at the very beginning, but were the mutinying McNab settlers, they were all Orangemen or Scotsmen as well? Or were these was this like a Protestant versus Catholic kind of thing?
No, so it was Protestant versus Protestant. They were Highlanders, Scottish Highlanders. So they likely were Presbyterian, but they were very traditional Scottish Highlanders. Whereas the Irish Protestants were, of course, Orangemen, very conservative and very loyal to the crown and to the government. So to them, the Highlanders were kind of a foreign people, if you will. They would have been, at the time, they would have been viewed as a completely different ethnicity. I know obviously today, Irish and Scottish, people of Irish and Scottish descent mix all the time and no one really knows or cares. But at the time, it would have been a pretty big deal. There would have been a lot separating Irish and Scottish at the time. And so, yes, it was Protestant versus Protestant, but it was more so conservative versus more progressive, or loyal versus disloyal, as I termed it.
Okay, thanks. Two other very quick things. Were there any Indigenous peoples involved in any of these skirmishes or this skirmish? And how did McNab, I wondered how McNab kind of dealt with them. He sounded like quite a despicable human being. So I'm assuming he wasn't particularly friendly to the Indigenous people that probably lived in this area. And maybe Fern, you know more. I'm not really aware of what Indigenous people lived here. And then my final point was simply, if this guy was so despicable, why are we still living in McNab Township?
Yeah.
Thank
so
you
I
for
guess, yeah, the second question about the Indigenous people, there's no mention of them in Dugald's account, which would make sense. In the 1860s, people were still, obviously quite racist, but also they wouldn't really have focused on Indigenous people and issues anyways, even if they were there. So they might have been on the sidelines. As I mentioned, there were probably quite a few people just watching on, but there's no record of them. There are records of Indigenous people visiting Pakenham at the time, even from around the same year. One story I know is that when one of Andrew Dixon's daughters was born, she was the first white person born in what is now Pakenham Village. So local natives who lived in the area would stop by to look at her because they had never seen a white baby. So there were Indigenous people in the area. I don't think in very large numbers by this point. And even if they were in large numbers, they certainly wouldn't really have cared much for the militia, seeing as the militia never really cared much for them. And the third question about why is it still McNabb Township? No idea. That's something you can bring up to McNabb Council for sure.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, no problem.
Were there any other questions?
I'm confused. The McNabb people were Scottish Highlanders, so they were Protestant. Where were the Catholic Irish coming from? Fitzroy?
Ireland.
Yeah, but Fitzroy or Arnprior, or where were the Irish?
So yeah, the Irish, Pakenham and Fitzroy were predominantly Irish, and they were predominantly Irish Protestant. Any Irish Catholics would have been descendants of the Robinson settlers, the Peter Robinson settlers. They numbered quite few at this time because many had left the area by the late 1830s. But yes, there certainly were Irish Catholics as well. Again, they're not really mentioned in any of these accounts. And they would have been kind of neutral. They certainly weren't as conservative as the Protestants. So they probably wouldn't have felt as convicted, I guess. Their conviction wasn't as strong, so they really weren't probably willing to fight for what they thought was right. They probably just were going along with it because they had to. It was the militia. Everyone was conscripted into it.
What I have here is that the Pakenham Fencibles were mostly Irish Roman Catholic. And the Fitzroy Blazers were Anglican Orangemen, and the McNabbs were Presbyterian Scots. So I don't know.
Yeah, and again, there's only one actual account of the battle, so we kind of are just left in the air about the finer details. And so that's sort of what the last part of the presentation was about, right? Trying to sort out fact from fiction. And I don't think we'll ever know. I think all the details will kind of be a little blurry. What we do know is that at some point, some Irish Protestants got into a fight with some Highlanders. And I think Dugald McNabb sort of insinuated that the Irish Protestants sort of won, if anyone won. I think the Highlanders sort of got the short end of the stick in that one. But yes, ultimately it all came crashing down for McNabb in the following decades. So at least they were vindicated.
And I would just like to say the Pakenham Irish Catholics are a pretty wonderful group, musical and just delightful people.
Robert, just a couple of comments, not a question, but information on the militias. Under the Upper Canada Militia Act of the early 1800s, it was compulsory service once a year minimum to turn out all able-bodied men after the age of 18. Usually was done on June the 5th, which was the King's birthday. All of the events took place in the morning. If you didn't have a gun, as you mentioned, you put a broomstick or you put a pitchfork over your shoulder. There's actually a C.W. Jeffreys picture you had the image of that's famous for that. The activities of the mustering training were all completed by noon hour. And usually at that time, they went on to have games. The children and families were involved, horseshoes, tug of war, and most importantly, they opened up the kegs of beer. And that's written right in history. That so you can imagine by supper time, if the beer's flowing and it's free, tempers would be flying for those arguments. So I don't think it was an uncommon thing to get a little fisticuffs going on.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned the Ballygiblin riots, because that's basically what happened at the Ballygiblin riots. And so we can just sort of infer, I guess, that may have been what happened in Pakenham. But yes, and that's why the account of the Scottish raiding McFarland's Inn for weapons, taking tongs and broomsticks and whatever, pokers, because they wouldn't have had rifles. So the only weapons they had were whatever solid objects they could find.
And that brings down to the same question that came up earlier about looking for artifacts. if there was no gunfire taking place, there wouldn't be any musket balls to have as a souvenir of the battle itself. As you say, it would have been just, a frying pan or a poker or whatever. So whatever was at hand.
Right. Yes. Ken, you have your hand up.
Yes. Hi, Robert. I really enjoyed your presentation. I just a couple of comments. I believe the Laird McNab came from the Killen area of which is the western end of Loch Tay in Perthshire. There's a large McNab cemetery right in the town and close to a nice pub. As well, I believe after he was forced out of McNab Township, he went to his brother's home in Hamilton, Ontario. The brother built something which is still there today, and that's called Dundurn Castle. It's not really a castle, but it's still called it, and it's used for social events. And in fact, my niece just got married there on Halloween Day a week or so ago. I guess, and the third thing, just to comment about battles or skirmishes. In my lifetime, and it wasn't that long ago, there was an Orange Parade in Carleton Place when they still had the Orange Walks. And as the day went on, of course, it's a warm time of year. I'm sure a lot of beer was consumed. And there was some kind of a riot broke out between the Orangemen and the local carnival folk who had set up a kind of a fair up in the fairgrounds. They called, of course, there was only one policeman at the time, probably was Herb Cornell. So they called up the fire department, the Ocean Wave Fire Department, in desperation. And the idea was the fire truck would turn the hoses on the rioters and disperse them. But the rioters were ingenious and started cutting the hoses. So this all happened in my lifetime. So these things do happen. And from a bystander, it sure would look like a battle.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I tried to make a point of towards the end of the presentation. Like something like that, what you just described is probably pretty similar to what happened at the Battle of Pakenham. And something like that, it's not something that many people would have written about because, again, it wasn't really that big of an event, but it was significant to Pakenham just because nothing like it has ever happened since and will probably never happen again. So yes, thank you for sharing that. Yes, Duncan?
When I mentioned the Orange Day, Arthur Maloney, who was one of the top lawyers in Toronto, was from Eganville, which there's each side of the river, Protestant and Irish, when you're where they used to be up there. And he said that the story was the priest found a young fellow who was new to town and wasn't known, and got him to go over to the Orange side for the Orange Day, because there was a lot of celebration. A lot of Irish suddenly became Protestants and went to these things too. And he came back and reported to the priest that there really wasn't a problem. He said there were Polish Catholics and Irish Catholics and German Catholics, but he said the only ones that they don't like are Roman Catholics, and there weren't any Romans there.
Yeah. And it all comes down to the Irishman, doesn't it? Always stirring the pot. Thank you, Duncan. Sean, I think you have a question. Okay. Or not.
Hi there.
Oh,
Yes, sorry,
yeah.
I can't turn my camera on for some
That's fine.
reason, but can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Sean Donaldson, and my dad is on this call, and he's Gordon Donaldson. And I just actually, I like my dad's questions a lot. And I had just two questions and one comment. But my dad had asked just about if a metal detector had been used and just a bit about some of the artifacts. but it got me thinking. You said with your research you had done some investigation. I just wondered if museums or maybe any local sources, are there any artifacts at all that were uncovered from the battle or of that time, and are they in museums that are nearby? And I just wondered as well if you had used museums at all in your research. And then I had one other question.
Yeah, so as far as artifacts, no, not that I'm aware of. Actually, I know that in the big fire in 1940, like when I mentioned that a lot of buildings in Pakenham burned down, one of the people who lost their house actually had a collection of Andrew Dixon's personal artifacts, and they were all lost in the fire. So if there were many artifacts from the battle or the time of the battle, a lot of them were destroyed then. But yeah, and so far as I know, nobody's gone through there with a metal detector. It's partly an industrial area now. So that there is a park there, so somebody could still go in that little area. And as far as museums in my research, absolutely, yeah. The North Lanark Regional Museum, I sort of took over there for a day. Most of the stuff about the Battle of Pakenham I found in the Arnprior McNabb archives, which are in Arnprior. You can find the letters there between Hessel and Halliday, as well as some of the stuff that Hessel wrote about the battle. It's all pretty much the same as what I talked about today. But yes. And what was your third question?
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. And then my last question was, one of the members have already raised this question, but it was about Indigenous people and sort of what was the situation with Indigenous people, and you answered it, and I think you did a great job on it. But I just wondered, just to push that question a little bit further, do you know anything about the location of some of the Indigenous people in relation to the village? And just the reason why I ask is that my dad and I are from many generations in Lanark County, and I grew up in Pakenham, and I just have always been interested on the Indigenous side, and I just don't know very much about it. So I just wondered if you knew at that time, just where they were located. You said there weren't many of them, but I just wondered if you had any more insight, or maybe could tell us, do you know where we could go to learn more about that?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of maybe a couple things I stumbled upon in my research. I know at one point it was mentioned that near White Lake there was a reserve, and that lasted only until the 1890s or so. It was sort of not, I don't want to say privately owned reserve, but somebody owned it and they just sort of let the Indigenous people live there. I'm not sure exactly where near White Lake. I just remember reading about that. At this time, the land was purchased by the government from the local Indigenous people, what was called the Rideau Purchase. So basically, the Indigenous people had no sovereignty over the land, but they were still allowed to live here and hunt here and fish here and do whatever. They just couldn't own the land. So they were nomadic people, so they moved around a lot. I know in McNabb Township, there were quite a few along the Madawaska River, because I recall reading how Andrew Dixon befriended the chief of a local tribe, but it sounds like it was really just a couple families. And they lived along the Madawaska River, not far from Pakenham and Arnprior, and the chief drowned one day in the rapids. So along the Madawaska River. But as far as big groups of Indigenous people, haven't really stumbled upon anything. There's sort of a rumor, I guess, that Indian Hill, which is south of Pakenham, was used. There's a couple of different versions of the story. Some say it was an old Algonquin burial ground. Others say it was an old trading post that Algonquins came to and traded. Some people say that Indian Creek used to be a portaging route for the Algonquins to get to Clayton Lake and the Indian River, so there certainly are links to Indigenous history around, but no, as far as how many there were, where they lived, details like that just really weren't written down. Yeah, so that's all the information I have. Sorry.
No, Robert. Thank you. That's a lot of information, and I actually grew up on Indian Hill Road. I've always
Okay.
wanted to know. So just even that speculation is really helpful to me. My
Yeah.
very last question. I've taken up too much time, but my very last question: could you tell us where we can buy your book?
Yeah, I think I put the link in the chat that you can click on. You might have to scroll up a bit because it takes you to a Google document, a Google form. You just fill it out and hit submit at the bottom, and then you've pre-ordered a copy, and the copies will probably be ready in February or March.
Okay, great, Robert. Thank you. Excellent work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for taking the time to prepare your presentation for us and teaching us all about this lesser known area of Pakenham history. I know I can't wait to get my hands on the book you've published, and I really look forward to reading it. I'll also be sure to include the link to pre-order the book in a follow-up email that will be going out to everybody who registered probably tomorrow or by Friday. I'd also like to take this opportunity to note that the North Lanark Historical Society and Regional Museum is gearing up for an exciting holiday season with new events and programs happening in November and December. Our Scenes of Christmas Past exhibition will open on November 21st, and then on December 1st, we're hosting a holiday-themed afternoon tea with local author Claudia Smith and Appleton resident Eleanor Wright sharing holiday stories alongside readings from historic letters in the museum collection. Then on December 3rd, the museum will be open for a day of festive family fun with special crafts, a scavenger hunt, and some Christmas cookies for all attendees. So to keep up to date on all museum events, you can subscribe to our mailing list by emailing nlrmuseum@gmail.com. Thank you again so much for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your evening.